Okay. When we were waiting for you, we were talking to that kid who was driving the Zamboni, and he's talking about all the leagues they have around here. You probably know some of this from having your own kids come up. You know, they lived in Chicago when they were growing up, and they've got to pay $500 or whatever it is as a fee to play, and the equipment costs more.
Wait, this doesn't sound right here, Roy. What? Something's not right. Feed me line level.
I'm giving you line level.
Give me tone, man. We were fine. If you talk once, just say
Yes, 1, 2, 3, 4.
All right. What was it like for you when you were growing up? I mean, it wasn't like this, I imagine. What was it like?
Oh, it was hockey was likely as different back then as a kid as professional hockey is the same difference when I played as when I was a kid playing, and these kids coming up now. We never had any helmets. We didn't have any helmets because, first of all, we couldn't afford them. I'm from a family of 11, and we not only could not afford helmets, but there weren't any around. They hadn't manufactured any for kids. I think Bill Mosienko maybe at that time was wearing one, a little leather, a couple of leather strips around the front of his head and around the back, but we didn't have any helmets. I wore my dad's leather work mitts, and we didn't have any shin pads or anything like that, and went out and played shinny on the bay and on the ponds, and spent hours and hours shoveling the ice off to get a spot to play. And then, of course, there'd only be a half a dozen of us, and then it'd be just like the ants coming out of the anthill. Once we got the ice shoveled off, then there'd be hundreds of kids out on the ice, and that, of course, that would spoil our hockey game. But all in all, we really enjoyed that time getting prepared to play a game of shinny, and we'd wait until the kids would go home in the evening, and then we'd scrape the old open-air rink off or the pond, and we'd throw a little flood on it, wait till it froze, and then we'd have a real game of shinny. I didn't start playing organized hockey until I was 10 years old, and then all we had was a Bantam league and a midget league and juvenile. It went, Bantam was 14 to 16, midget was 16 to 18, and juvenile, excuse me, I think I got a little ahead of myself. 12 to 14, I guess, was Bantam. 14 to 16 was midget, and 16 to 18 was juvenile, and then they played junior after that. And as I said, I was 10 years old when we first started playing organized hockey, and I borrowed my brother-in-law's equipment. I was very fortunate. He had the shin pads with the cane in the shin guards and the cane in the gloves, and I was just happy to have that kind of equipment to play. And it wasn't organized. We played once a week, and it didn't cost us anything at all for the ice rental. It was paid for from the athletic organization in Belleville, Ontario. And we played once a week, the Bantams on Saturday morning, the midgets on Thursday evening. And we would get together that one time a week. We'd go around the ice and warm up a couple of times. The referee would blow the whistle, and the coach would say, "Okay, guys, over to the box." And he'd say, "You go in goal, you and you on defense, you and you go on the forward line. The rest of you get in the bench here, and we'll figure it out from there." There were no practices like the kids do now, and my kids, I know, heck, they were practicing at 11 o'clock at night and 6:30 in the morning before school. But we met that one time a week and played for our hour, and the rest of the time we'd get together out on the Bay of Quinte or on the ponds or in the old open-air rink and play that game we called shinny.
Was that in terms of how much fun you had playing hockey, was that the most fun you ever had playing when you just were a kid like that?
Oh, I can't really remember back that far. When you get to be my age, three things happened. You know, you lose your memory, and I can't remember the other two things. But no, I of course enjoyed playing hockey ever since I can remember, because it was my life. I dreamed about at one time in my life being either old enough or big enough to play professional hockey. It wasn't a matter of whether I was going to be good enough. It was just a matter of time that I was going to be a professional hockey player. And I know my dad would come home and it'd be 90 degrees in the middle of July or August, and I'd have my hockey equipment on. And he'd, of course, wonder why in the deuce I'd have my hockey equipment on. And I said I was just trying it on to make sure it would fit to get ready for the hockey season come November and December. But I believe I had the most fun. And maybe you talk about fun getting around to the kids today, maybe not having as much fun, maybe being a little too organized. Possibly that's true, but I had the most fun when I was right here in the city of Chicago for 15 years playing for the Blackhawks. This is the greatest city in the world, and of course, the people in a city make the city as great as it is, and we had a love affair with our Blackhawk fans, and these were the greatest years of my life right here in Chicago.
Let me go back a little bit. We've talked to maybe a dozen guys who were good athletes. George Blanda, and well, he's one that sticks out in my mind.
He could still be kicking field goals,
That's
couldn't
right.
he?
but a lot of these guys will say that. For money.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's tighter than a buzzard's ass in a power dive.
He didn't say that. He said, right, I forgot my question.
You talk to a lot of guys
he
that were.
He said, a few of these guys said that they knew at an early time that they were, you just said it too, you knew you were going to be a professional player.
Just
now,
a
look,
matter
there
of
were
time.
6 teams at that time in the NHL, about 20 guys on the team. You're talking about, what,
You're talking about 120 of the best athletes in the world at that time.
How did you know that you were going to make it?
It was just that feeling that I had. It was I won't say it was an obsession because I didn't know what obsessions were at that age, but I loved the game so much, and fortunately I was strong enough and loved it enough that I would shovel snow all day to get that time to play. And when I did play, I knew that I could skate maybe a little better than the ordinary and shoot a little harder than the ordinary. And when I would listen in our old Philco radio that would fade in and out, when Foster Hewitt would say, "Hello, Canada and hockey fans of the United States and Newfoundland," those old goosebumps used to come on my flesh like robin's eggs. And when he'd talk about the Howes and the Richards and the Bellevaux and the Wally Stanowskis and the Ted Kennedys and the Silapses and the Max Bentleys and that group, I could just picture myself playing in the same stadium as these guys. And as I said earlier, it was just a matter of time for me that I was going to be a professional athlete.
You were a good football player also.
As a matter of fact, while I was going to school in St. Catharines, the year before I turned pro, I was offered a football scholarship to Colorado Springs. And all I had to do was finish my grade 12, and I was going to play football. And ironically enough, I was enrolled in school at St. Catharines, at the St. Catharines Collegiate. Stan Makita and I were classmates, and we played junior together in St. Catharines. And I was already enrolled in school and playing football for the senior football team at school. And the night before I turned pro, I had played football after school and didn't get home to my boarding place, Orvin Edith Christie, until about 6:30. And when I walked in the door, Mrs. Christie said, "You're in for it now." And I said, "Well, now what had I done?" And she said, Bob Wilson, who was then Chief Eastern Scout for the Blackhawks, had been calling every half hour trying to find me. And just as I went to sit down to dinner of meat and potatoes and gravy, roast beef dinner, the phone rang, and she said, "You better get it, it's going to be for you." So when I answered the phone, it was Bob Wilson, and in no uncertain terms he demanded where I was. And I said I had played football after school. And he said, "Football?" He said, "You're supposed to play in an exhibition game with the Blackhawks against the New York Rangers on that particular night." So I gobbled my dinner down, made a couple of phone calls to make arrangements for tickets for my landlady and landlord and my girlfriend, and just got down there in time to get dressed for the game. And I was fortunate enough to score 2 goals against Gump Worsley that night. And after the game, Tommy Ivan called me up in his hotel room and asked me if my mom and dad were planning on coming up to the training camp. And I said, well, not likely. My dad worked shift work. He said, well, do you think that they could, your dad could get off and come up tomorrow? And I said, well, I can call. If you want to place the call, I can do it right now. So I called Mom and Dad, and they thought something was wrong. And I said, no, there's nothing wrong, Mr. Ivan. And I didn't know what he wanted them up there for. I said, Mr. Ivan just wants you to come up tomorrow. So Dad made arrangements to change his shift with someone, and they came up, and that's when they told or asked Mom and Dad if they could turn me pro, and I was 18 at that time.
Tell us a little more about your father. He's still alive, isn't he?
Still alive. We lost our mom last January 1st, and my dad was likely the driving force behind me, although if it hadn't been for my mom, I'd have never made it. I couldn't have stood the abuse that I took from my dad. And when I look back on it, it was just his way of keeping me down to earth and not letting me think that I was too much better than anyone else. I'd go out and score 6 or 7 goals playing minor hockey as a kid, and I'd come in and thought I'd really cut a mean swath, and he'd be there, well, you lazy sucker, you should have had 15. And of course, this was right in front of all my peers, and I felt like going right under the bench. And out on the ice, my dad always sat at one end of the rink and my mom at the other, and that's when they had chicken wire instead of the glass. And when I'd go around the net with the puck at the one end, my mom would be there saying, "That a boy, Robert, you can do it." And I'd build up a head of steam, and I'd beat everyone, go in on the goaltender, and I'd either hit him in the pads or hit him in the belly or shoot the puck 6 or 8 feet wide of the net, and my dad would be right there behind the bench. Well, you couldn't put the puck in the ocean. And that's when I was a back checker. I'd head down the other end of the rink to get some solace from my mom. But Dad used to, no matter if I was playing ball, and I used to play ball, I pitched fastball at the 12-inch, and everything would be quiet in the stands while I was fanning everybody out and hitting the ball out of the park. But let me strike out one time, or let someone get a hit off me, and then that's all you could hear would be him criticizing me. But as I said earlier, I think that he just did it just to keep me down to earth. And I remember the year, the summer before, I scored 50 goals for the first time. And that's when Jeffrey Ann and the Rocket had scored, and the only 2. And we got talking with my brothers. We always had a jam session after I'd come home from hockey, and Dennis and Gary, brother Gary and Ron, and my dad would always get together, and he said, you'll never score 50 goals. So I said to myself, I'll show him. And the next year I scored the 50 goals.
I'm sure he probably said that to give you that little impetus to do it.
I think my dad did. He was calculating, and I think everything that he did to bring out the best in me, or to provide me with that desire to go on and better myself, no matter how good I may have thought I was.
You said here just a while ago, and you say, there's a lot of newspaper clips that have you saying the best years of your life were as a Blackhawk. Yet, what you did with the WHA and with Winnipeg, it seems to me anyway, was really important. What was that experience like, going there? It was very important to a lot of people, and when it was talked about, I really didn't think that anything would come of it, because Chicago was the only team that I wanted to play for, and Chicago was the only city that I wanted to live and play for. And when it came down to the nitty-gritty, I told my dad, I talked to him and told him that there was a possibility of me going to Winnipeg and in the new formed WHA, and he said, Robert, he said, I hope you know what you're getting into. He said, first of all, he said, you're 32 years old. He said, they're going to ask a great deal of you. You're going to have to not only play, you're going to have to promote, you're going to be demanded upon in every city in the league to promote not only the Winnipeg Jets, but their particular franchise too. And he said, next of all, he said, you're not going to like Winnipeg because it's so cold there that you're not going to enjoy it. And I'd never been to the Western provinces before that.
we had had a junket when I played junior out through the Western Provinces, but the coach, Rudy Pillis, at that time said, any of you kids in school, if you want to stay in and complete your classes, you're more than welcome to stay in St. Catharines instead of making the trip. So I opted to stay in school to get my year and never went west. Little did I know how right Dad was again, and if I'd listened to my mother and father my entire life, I'd have never been in trouble. When my mother said, Robert, you better take your raincoat, you're going to get, nah, it's not going to rain, and I got soaked. When she said, you better take another sweater, it's going to be cold, I froze. When I didn't, my dad said, you hadn't better fool around with gals, you'll get in trouble. I did. But he was right again. I did have to promote the entire league, and a lot was asked of me, and I hated Winnipeg as far as the weather was concerned. Not the city itself or the people, but it was just so blessed cold that I could never really get used to it. So, second year I was there, 6 weeks in a row, it never got above 20 below. And you can imagine, in some of those mornings, 60 below with the wind chill factor, 40 below, ice crystals in the air. So that part of it, Dad was right again, and I didn't really enjoy it. But I was not going to say die. And if our Winnipeg team had not survived, and very easily if I'd have given up the ghost, it would have folded likely. And I said, we're going to keep this thing going, and as long as we keep our Winnipeg Jet team alive and well, the WHA will survive. And of course, as you know, we did survive for 7 years, much to the chagrin of a lot of people in the NHL. And we created a lot of great hockey players. As a matter of fact, that first year that the two leagues got together, out of the top 20 scorers, 10 of those were from the WHA. And of course, all I need to do is tell you that a kid by the name of Gretzky, that wears number 99 on his back, and of course that's because he's twice as good as any of those other number 9s. He came out of the WHA, and WHA team, after 5 short years, and I'm talking about Edmonton, won the Stanley Cup. There's some of these NHL teams, they could go for 105 years and never win a Stanley Cup with the attitude that they're taking towards the game.
The two guys that you skated with, Hedberg and Nilsson, the two Swedish guys, talk a little bit about
fantastic athletes, and they came along the third year I was there. And if it hadn't been for those two kids, and not only Alfie and Anders, but Lars-Erik Schuberg, who was our little general, he was our captain and a great little guy, and a kid by the name of Mike Ford. We played as a fivesome. In Winnipeg, we had 3 groups of 5, and we played those fivesomes together all the time. And that way, of course, we were used to Lars-Erik and Mike Ford on defense, and it got so that we played as a unit. Each one knew what the other was going to do, and the other groups of 5, they got feeling the same way. But that Hedberg and Nilsson, 2 of the most talented players that I ever played with, and they came to play every game. I didn't have to ask them to get up for the games. They were there, they came to play. Their attitude was so refreshing that they made the game fun for me. And I played with a lot of talented hockey players here in Chicago and when I went to Winnipeg, but they likely suited my style of play better than anyone else, because as you remember, I was all over like a can of worms, and those guys played that same way too, that same style. If I'd go over on the right side, Anders would go into the center and Alfie would go on the left side, and we just changed position, and we just realized that we had to fill each position when we changed. But they were refreshing.